what I wanted to talk to you about was three things, but mostly about how the way this government conducts itself. So that's the primary purpose for my appearing before you today. Number one is how it deals with the basic needs of our people. Ano yung pinaka-basic na pangangailangan ng taong bayan? 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, the president announced that food prices had gone down, that inflation had gone down, and that they were actually celebrating it and saying that this was a direct result of government intervention. However, yesterday I was speaking with people who go to market, the urban leaders or urban poor communities. Okay na. Leaders from urban poor communities. And simple question, because I also go to the market, I ask them, namamalengke po ba kayo? Yes, to a man, but they're mostly women. And I ask them, point blank, nagmura ba ang pagkain? Of course, yes, and in fact, I see a lot of people affirming here. The price of rice has not gone down, bigas. Yet the claim, the kind of outlandish claim as of 2.5 weeks ago is that rice prices went down. How could that have gone down? So I went to the market just to check if this is true. Apparently, what they're claiming as rice prices having gone down is that they released a certain amount of rice in the market to be sold at 45 pesos per kilo. Closer. Mahina si likod. So, ayun. Okay na? Can you hear me? Yun. Right. So, yung pala, yung bumaba daw ang presyo ng bigas kasi meron silang nirelease na 45 pesos per kilo na bigas. Ito yung kadiwa rice. So, ang claim nila was based on that. May 45 pesos per kilo na bigas. Unfortunately, konti lang yun. The main supply is still set at 56 to 58 pesos for the better kind of rice. The lowest price of rice that is edible for human consumption is at about 52 pesos. But if you're lucky, you might be able to get 48 kung nandun kayo malapit sa area kung saan nagsasaka ng bigas. So, rice being the staple, the government made the outlandish claim na bumaba na ang presyo ng bigas, bumaba ang presyo ng pagkain, at bumaba ang inflation. Ang inflation dito sa Pilipinas is pushed primarily by food. Inflation all over the world is pushed primarily by the price of fuel. And this is true also dito sa Pilipinas. So mataas ang presyo ng pagkain, how ironic, mataas ang presyo ng pagkain, kumakain tayo. So, mataas ang presyo ng pagkain, sabi nila, the government says that the reason for that is because of the prices of fuel. Yes, that is true, but only in part. In this country, the prices of our food are dictated by middlemen and not by producers. So, sino ang producers? Mga magsasaka. So, it makes sense na paalagaan natin ang mga magsasaka natin. But is that true? Well, the Department of Agriculture has one of the biggest budgets, particularly during the time that the President was the Secretary. One of the biggest budgets. Probably the third, debt servicing, education, and then agriculture. But the Department of Agriculture did not make a dent in rice prices. Instead, they have a notices of disallowance for several years. Bakit? What they do is they have a programmatic approach. Ibig sabihin, mahal ang presyo ng fertilizer, gawa tayo ng programa para sa fertilizer, gawa tayo ng voucher system, which is riddled with corruption. Corruption that the President is aware of, but not doing anything about it. Ano pa? Mahal, walang mechanization sa farms. Okay, bili tayo ng farm equipment. And to the credit of the DA, during the time of President Duterte, meron naman talaga, but they are held by the LGUs and the farmers can borrow them. But even with all of these programs, whether they work or not, it's very spotty if they actually really work because of the corruption involved in the agency. Meaning, sa ibang probinsya, gumagana siya. Enough so that the department can claim success. But it doesn't happen everywhere. So if they can claim 10% success in the country, okay na yun. I-claim na ng DA na wow, under the President, ang galing-galing ng Department of Agriculture. Of course, they did not try to make that claim. Nevertheless, under the President's watch, the prices of food have consistently gone up and have not gone down. So what was the reaction of the government in relation to this? Sabi nila, dahil mataas ang presyo ng pagkain, kailangan importation. And that would be normally an emergency response. Kulang ang bigas, under the old NFA law, pag kulang ang bigas, tataas ang presyo, NFA will import. And it will release strategically so that the market prices will be targeted. Kahit paano, it won't go too high. Under this administration, there is no more NFA to regulate importation. And the importers are friends of the President. Therefore, the importation policy that was released 3 months ago removed the caps on importation, the quantities. They lowered the import duties. And then they extended the deadline. What happened? During the pandemic, because we needed cheap food, kailangan mag-import. So they lowered the tariffs for certain products, pork and rice included. This was an exception to the rice tariffication law. The deadline was supposed to be December 2023. In anticipation of the end of the pandemic, the president extended that to December 2024 and lowered the tariff rates further and increased the quotas further. Which means that since we had difficulty with importation even before, with importers competing with local manufacturers, growers, sorry, we barely manufacture anything now, but local growers now compete with cheap agricultural products from abroad in larger quantities and with cheaper prices. What does this mean for our farmers? It means that every year we lose more and more farmers. They sell more and more of the agricultural land, even the ones that the government had spent on for irrigation. So, ang nabibenta po ay irrigated land. Ginastusan natin yon, pero yun ang nabibenta kasi hindi na kaya ng magsasaka. And despite the many programs, it's still failing because there is no intention to make it work. The importation policy is clear. The president says it's a temporary measure. But yes, it was a temporary measure which should have ended last year. It did not. And yet they had the temerity 2.5 weeks ago to tell us, okay na yung presyo ng bigas. It's an outright lie. Unfortunately, nobody has picked up on it. Pero, every time we eat, nararamdaman natin yan. Every time I give a talk, there are things that we need to remember. Ang ingay-ingay ng politics. You notice what's happening in Congress, di ba? It's always an attack Duterte strategy. And I understand, nakikita ko nga, to some extent, bilib din ako sa kulit nila eh. Pero, while they're doing this, the prices of food are through the roof. Water has not returned to its usual levels. In January of 2024 and in January of 2023, the water companies raised their prices. They do that every year in anticipation of the summer months. 2024 was particularly insidious because it was a higher increase in anticipation of El Nino. Bumabaha na po. Pero hindi bumalik ang presyo ng tubig. Again, we're always led to believe that these temporary measures are in fact temporary, but it never is. So water and food, basics, things that we need to survive, the prices are going up. Let's not even talk about healthcare. So with all the news about the PhilHealth scandal, 90 billion pesos being returned to the treasury so that the president has access to it somehow, rankles on us. Kasi ang laki nang nawala. Early in the administration, tumigil po yung 100 million a month to the PGH. But with the hopes that better and more efficient PhilHealth will pick up the slack. Unfortunately, that hasn't held true. With the hopes that the PCSO and and PAGCOR would also pick up the slack because their real intention was to supplement the health needs of people. That has not happened. Not in recent years. Not in recent months. The PCSO has winners left and right, which technically means that the PCSO also earns. And that a certain amount, in fact, during the Duterte administration, it was pretty high, would go to the service of the people to augment the costs of medicines. So again, that's not happening now. And this is a reversal. Dati meron na. Ngayon, wala na. Ganun lang kasimple yung difference. Other part of the Universal Healthcare Act was supposed to set aside money for the education of medical workers, for healthcare workers. They're supposed to begin programs so that we have more doctors, more nurses, institute rules so that the nurses don't leave. But that has not happened, and we have no news about that. Instead, we have news of a possible epidemic of childhood diseases that are preventable, but are going to be on the rise because there are no vaccines. These are DPT, the Penta vaccines that we give to in early childhood. So DPT, MMR. So immunization is down because of the vaccination scandals, but it is much worse now because there are no cold storage to keep any of the vaccines. Not only that, the vaccines didn't arrive until very, very recently. So, food, water, healthcare, electricity scandal. Mona Lisa Di Malata was my batchmate in the College of Law. And she's quite, and Popo Lutilia was our professor. So, you would think that brilliant minds in the Department of Energy would translate into some kind of self-sufficiency. Makahabol man lang tayo. Ang daming renewables na available, and the President has always talked about creating the right mix. Kasi binabalanse dapat natin yung renewables with the traditional sources of energy. How can we talk about right mixes when there are no renewables yet coming in? In 2022, Secretary Lotilla announced that they were already in the stage of talks with UK firms about certain new types of renewables. Up to this day, talks pa rin yun. Wala pa rin tayo na pag-uusapan. We have coal-fired plants. We have a different set of rules for certain producers who seem to be a protected class. Okay? Merong rules para dun sa iba. Yung rules na yon, exempt sila, they can pass on certain costs to the consumers. Okay? Ibig sabihin tayo nagbabayad ng taxes nila. Okay? There are companies who don't. They have to bear their own taxes. But certain very well-protected companies, they can pass on that rate to us. What does this mean for our bill? It means we're paying for their taxes on top of our own and on top of our electricity. So, food, water, healthcare, electricity, transportation. With a single runway in the airport, one would think that, that we don't, well, what kind of tourism does one expect? Not much. Fortunately, may Bulacan Airport nga na parating. But in spite of that, considering that we have international airports all over the country, we can't pick up the slack. Tourism was supposed to save us post-pandemic. Unfortunately, what the person appointed as Secretary of Tourism is not a person who understands tourism at all, nor has any experience whatsoever beyond being mayor of a small town in Cebu. I have no complaints about her as a person, but her experiences do not lend credence to managing tourism in this country or even improving its state. What is tourism? Tourism is marketing. It will require a person who understands what the tourism product is. What is the tourism product? Philippine culture. It is what makes us different from the rest of the world. These are the basic things that a tourism secretary needs to understand. However, it remains unclear why the tourism secretary seems to believe that traveling all over the world is part of the job. Siguro if you're attending seminars or you're learning something, I would understand. If you're forging agreements, if you're making exchanges with other countries pertaining to tourism arrivals, I would understand. But opening a Jollibee in the United Nations, in the UK, and visiting one in New York, I don't think counts as being part of the duties of the tourism secretary. It has not indicated an uptick in the number of tourism arrivals. And in fact, hindi pa rin nila inaayos, may daya kasi yan. If you really want to make it look like there are a lot of tourists, you include the balikbayas. We're not exactly tourists. The Filipinos coming home, and of course we want them to come home. We would love to have them to come home. But conversations with OFWs lately, sinasabi nila sa akin, kala namin for good na kami sa Pilipinas. That's apparently a thing. For good na sana kami sa Pilipinas, but at the rate things are going, hindi daw muna. That's what OFWs, homesick already and longing to come home, are saying. Ano pa kaya yung mga turista? Indicative of this also, the hesitancy in tourism arrivals is the crime rate. So as you may have noticed or possibly felt, the crime rate has increased. In spite of the very rosy picture that the PNP has presented to us, our insider sources have indicated that drug use has increased, drug-related crimes have increased, index crimes have increased. These are all interconnected. Of course, the presence of 8,000 police in Davao City at one point does not give us the confidence that we need that they are dealing with index crimes. Ano yung index crimes? Ito yung mga crimes sa kalye, robbery, rapes, things that we feel on the streets. Wala pong ganun. The index crimes are increasing. Police visibility, however, is primarily in Davao City. Ano why? So, again, what we're talking about here are priorities. We're talking about how the government conducts itself. It does not help when the highest officials of the land celebrate their birthday with Duran. At least that's what I heard last time. Have you heard? Yeah. So, it does not inspire confidence, kumbaga. Why? Because there's so many laws pertaining to the conduct of our officials. A party, for example, thrown for a high official has two implications. Either the official is the one who paid for it, in which case it is valid for us to ask where the money came from. Is it taxpayers' money? If it is thrown by a friend or family, it is reasonable for us to ask, anong kapalit? Which is why showing these things to the public do not inspire confidence. In fact, nakakagalit. And now we understand why there is so much noise against the government that seems to be concentrating on their own priorities rather than the priorities that the public demands of them, that the Constitution demands of them. Makakakita pa tayo ng congressional investigation, inquiry, or Senate inquiry that violates the rights of resource persons. What are the basic rights here? You can't ask a resource person to testify against themselves, to incriminate themselves. And yet we see that for all, out there, televised, with sometimes the legislators traipsing around and laughing and smiling, thinking na nakaisa sila. How do our government officials conduct themselves? How do they treat us, the public who put them in power? For me, these are the main concerns why we should be not just talking about it, but why we should be taking some kind of action. It is no longer tenable when the most basic needs of the people are not only ignored, they are used as basis for some kind of corruption. Springboards for corruption. You fail providing services, na nakawan pa tayo. And yet we see them enjoying themselves. This is where the great divide is. We clearly see the great divide. People who are enjoying themselves right now and people who are not, because that enjoyment of the few comes at the cost of the rest of us. So we go around, people like myself, Attorney Vip, we go around explaining what the situation is. Because at some point, we need to direct our disappointment, our anger, and the need to rectify the situation. Many of us in this room, we can still eat. Many of us don't need to worry about where the next meal is coming from. But a great majority of our people, a great number of our people, at least 20 million, are going to reach the point where the number of meals is going to be a decision every day. If rice prices go up any higher, they will be beyond the normal wage earners' capacity to buy. We're just talking about the most basic. We're just talking about rice. Do you know that we import fish? We have been importing fish. It's a recent phenomenon. We used to just smuggle it, but now we import it as well. With the quotas increasing, and with there used to be limitations on the kind of fish that we can import because you cannot or should not compete with local fishermen, and yet that happens. And so that's what I need to ask you to do, is could we think about this? And could we think about the kind of action that we're going to take on this? Because at some point, it's no longer just about us. It's about everybody else, and ultimately about our kids and our grandkids. This is not something that we can live with anymore. Every day that this happens is another day that we let it happen. And so at some point, we can say right now, kasalanan nila, ginagawa nila to sa atin. But the day is coming, and I think it's already today, that it becomes our responsibility and our fault if it continues. Thank you very much.